I'm going to get started. So, well, yeah, so like I said, thank you very much for coming to hear about my project that I've been working on the last sort of 18 months. Here I have my book, Need to Know. It's out 12th of September. 2 days' time. Very exciting. I can't wait. In fact, I think some people have actually received their copy a bit early through the post. So if you've received it, I hope, and you've had a chance to look through it, I hope you're enjoying it. It's yeah, it's out 12th of September. It's published by Icon Books. It's called A History of Baking, not The History of Baking, because the subject is absolutely huge. So I kind of decided to do the history that I wanted to tell, which I kind of mentioned it. If you kind of entered the waiting room quite early, I was talking about this before. There's some kind of serious history stuff in there, you know, about how and why baking may have come about. But there's also some more sort of frivolous throwaway stuff, which is kind of more fun. And hopefully this talk is going to sort of show off both of those aspects. It doesn't have the narrative arc of my previous two books, where I'm very much telling a chronological story, story in inverted commas, of course, because it's all nonfiction. But with this one, Icon Books contacted me to say, "Oh, do you fancy writing a book about the language of and the semantics of baking?" And I kind of thought, no, I wouldn't. Because that sounds a little bit like an encyclopedia or a dictionary or something to me. But what they wanted to do was have something where the chapters were very short. And of course, I've been writing a blog for quite a few years now. So I said, well, I'll tell you what, the idea of doing short posts or short little chapters is great. But how about we do the history? And I'll obviously throw in as much sort of terminology in there as possible. But if we could do history, then we can give it a narrative arc. Whilst also, if you wanted to, you can just dip in and out. So hopefully, I mean, we'll see when the book's out, but hopefully we've appeased both types of readers there. So you can put it next to the bed when you're reading in the evening, or put it next to the loo and just dip into a little chapter if you want, randomly. It's not a recipe book. I would dearly love to write a recipe book, but if there's any publishers out there, just letting you know. But there are things like rules of thumb and various rules about technique in there, because looking at how baking changes and evolves through the centuries, it means people working out the tech as they go along. You know, even before things like microscopes and chemistry, people were still working out the chemistry. They just didn't use those words to describe it. So hopefully you'll get an appreciation of the history, and hopefully too get more of an idea of what's going on in the mixing bowl as you're baking, and you become maybe a better baker. Those are my aims and objectives. So you can decide whether I've been successful in achieving them. One other thing is, oh yeah, whenever I listen to talks, it usually takes me a good 24 hours to think of a question. I like to sleep on it. So if you don't know me already, here's my Twitter /X Blue Sky. I'm at Neil Buttery, or Instagram threads, Dr._Neil_Buttery. And on Facebook, I've got a Facebook discussion group, which is a great place if you do want to do any discussions, ask questions, because there's quite a community building up on there. And it's facebook.com/British food history. And whilst I said there's no recipes in the book, there are lots of recipes on my blog, britishfoodhistory.com, such as things I've got here. Look, like Chelsea buns and Madeira cake are two recent ones. This, by the way, is a bride's pie from the 17th century. And this is Queen Victoria's Yorkshire Christmas pie, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later towards the end. So don't forget, we're out 12th of September, 2 days to go. So I don't know if you know this, some people know this, some people don't. My background, my academic background isn't in history. It's in evolutionary biology. And there's no set curriculum for anybody who's got into food history. Everyone's come into it from a different direction. I very much came from it from just sort of try to connect with British cooking again. I didn't worry too much about being authentic in inverted commas. I just tried to recreate them as close as I could with regular modern equipment. But then as I kind of do more research and, what was a hobby sort of became my job, I started very much approaching it from the scientific perspective because that's what I knew. A lot of other people come from an art history perspective or from a reenactments perspective. But when it comes to kind of doing proper research, as it were, I always go from a science way because that's just my nature, I suppose. So I always try and view things like technology changing as an evolution and try and draw a parallel really with us, because what I studied in particular was the evolution of cooperation and altruism and helping behaviors and how those can be kept going in a population when what we're told is survival of the fittest means you go around being pretty selfish. Well, that's obviously not that true because we're very helpful with each other. So that's what I looked at. And of course, baking, well, perhaps isn't now so much a communal thing and required a certain amount of altruism and cooperation and helping to carry on. So there's definitely parallels there. And I think it's fair to say, as a general term, if you think about the evolution of absolutely anything, you have an origin somewhere, and things change slowly over time and get more complex, get better. Well, we're going to look at that in a minute and decide whether things are getting better. Better means different things to different people. And one thing that I thought I would ask is what is the unit of evolution when we're talking about things evolve? What actually evolves? If we're talking about organisms, is it individuals evolving? Do genes evolve? What's the thing that's actually evolving? And it's a question that it's something that I didn't quite appreciate until I got into it from an academic perspective. And the answer is the community. It's the population that evolves, and that's I'm not necessarily talking about the scientific biological evolution. It includes things like the evolution of baking. Ideas swap around in a community, slowly improve. They might, if they're good ideas, they might spread around, and everyone starts changing what they do and doing this new thing. It might be that the ideas get sent to other populations, other groups further away. If you're looking really far back in our history. But changes are usually slow and they're carried by the population going forward through time. Sometimes, when you're looking at things like baking, sometimes there's big changes and alarm bells should ring when there's big changes happening quickly. Usually that's a bit of folkloric assumptions, usually by the Victorians, and they've got it wrong, or just a quite convincing but just wrong origin story. There's loads of those in the book. Some of them are ridiculous. I kept the most ridiculous in the book. Now, genes move around in populations. In evolutionary biology terms, might not want to talk about genes. We might want to talk about ideas like technology, like I said, and that is a meme. It's a word that's used quite a lot these days, isn't it? It's usually if a little cartoon or something, a little cartoon joke goes viral, people call it a meme. But from a scientific point of view, it's like genes are passed down through generations, memes are too. It's things like the things that your grandmother taught you. They're all memes from the point of view of baking, or your mum or your uncle or whoever it may be, or if you're a professional baker, your boss maybe told you. And these things have been handed down, changing slowly over time through generations. So what you get is different regional baking. So it depends on the raw materials that you've got. So we're talking about Britain, for example, oats and barley grow better up north, and you could perhaps get more wheat down south. And although we're quite global in our eating these days, these things still are true. I would say oats are probably more commonly eaten from the north of England up through Scotland than they are through the south, although I might be wrong about that, but I think that's a fair assumption. Cultures develop, differences between groups, and rituals develop too. Even if it's just things like having to put a cross on your bread before you put it in the oven to let out the evil spirits or whatever. Although I don't believe that one. I think putting a cross in a loaf of bread just makes it cook quickly and more evenly. But anyway, so really the story of baking, the evolutionary baking, it's a story of community and sharing, essentially. But here's the thing. It's not working, as a lot of people think. Evolution doesn't mean working towards some kind of perfection. What it is something getting pounced upon because there's a short-term improvement. Evolution of any kind does not look very far into the future. It's just thinking about the now. And you could say, from terms of baking, that evolution, oh, excuse me. Sorry, just letting a couple more people in. There we go. You could say evolution has led us down a bit of a bad path. What we have here is an Eccles cake. Now, I think, from a personal point of view, that is a piece of perfection. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing, a proper Eccles cake. You know, it's a fairly working class food, but, you know, it's just a delicious thing when made properly. Ditto, something like a rather more simple Yorkshire pudding. Being from Yorkshire, obviously, I'm going to be championing the Yorkshire pudding. Down here, this is my attempt at recreating a manchet loaf, which of course were the most expensive white loaves eaten in the Middle Ages and early modern periods. So that was definitely reaching a pinnacle of certainly of technology, making the whitest flour, but you know, only the richest were eating that. So that's not a good thing if you're looking at it from a point of view of being all fair. Also, of course, being such an aspirational country, we all want white bread because the people in their ivory towers were having white bread. And now in a world where we're realizing about how bad ultra processed foods are for us, you know, white bread is an early example of a ultra processed food. So, you know, is it good? But I mean, bread's cheap for everyone. It's got long shelf life now in supermarkets. Is that good? Is that bad? Yeah, it's hard to call. Here's Finder's French bread pizza. Now, 10-year-old me would have said this is the absolute pinnacle of baking perfection. I'm sure a lot, and 47-year-old me now certainly does not believe that. And then you've got down here, of course, Mr. Kipling's angel cakes. I mean, I just think these are the absolute worst. But of course, by having things like French bread pizzas, having things like angel cakes means the person doing most of the cooking, which historically is the housewife, by having these things suddenly frees women up to go out to work if they choose to. So, you know, that's a good thing, right? But what I'm saying is it's difficult to say what better is, because that means different things to different people of different ages, people of different genders, and also people of different classes or from different countries. And of course, we could say that it's led us down a high path where everyone's eating ultra processed food. So yeah, evolution is not very good at looking into the future, I'm afraid. And more importantly, I think because we do rely on supermarket food, skills have been lost and varieties disappearing. Anyway, if we're going to talk about the evolution of baking, then we need to start at the very, very beginning. We need to see how far back we can go to pinpoint what was going on that got the whole thing going. Because, of course, all humans around the world bake something. So how did it all kick off? Well, one of the things that I had to do when I was writing the book, I thought, okay, I got a bit stressed. I thought, well, what is baking, first of all? because this is going to help me decide what goes in the book. And it might seem like a very obvious question that isn't even worth analyzing. But as you found, we like to compartmentalize things, don't we? We like to have things in groups, and we don't like it when things straddle more than one group or fit into more than one group. We don't like it. But I reckon can we all agree that something baked is something cooked in an oven? Well, yes, but no as well, I would say, because what about roast in inverted commas beef? We call it roast beef, but very few people anyway are putting their beef on a spit and doing it in front of the fire. No, they're doing their roast beef in inverted commas. They're doing it in the oven, so it's really baked beef. You could say the same about a roast potato or even a baked potato. I mean, it is baked, right? But would you expect baked potatoes to be in an episode of the Great British Bake Off? I don't think so. Same for something like a casserole, although we're going to find out that perhaps casseroles should have gone in. And then also, if you want to go back to really rudimentary baking, I should have thought of a better word than that. That's not quite the right word, but there's things like griddle cakes, waffles, pancakes, singing hinnies, all that kind of stuff. Here's a nice Welsh bread that's cooked on a bake stone. So the original baking was done on a bake stone, piece of rock essentially, or a piece of stone, was eventually swapped for cast iron, like in this picture here. And I really like using bake stones to cook things on. So I thought, okay, well, they're not cooked in ovens, but technically this is also baking. So that's got to go in the book. Fine. But then the stuff that I call baking adjacent, things that aren't baked in or cooked in ovens, but you might see on the Great British Bake Off, for example. So things like a steamed pudding. They've definitely done steamed or boiled puddings on the Great British Bake Off. I seem to remember a Sussex pond pudding being made once. But do you know what? I thought, I'm not going to include any of those because the subject's so big. I'm not going to put things that are baking adjacent in there. And then there's the work of the pastry chef, the patissier, which today, well, it means, of course, literally, there's somebody who works with pastry. So you expect everything that they make to be baked, but that's not the case because they're in charge of the whole dessert trolley, aren't they? So there's mousses and ice creams and things like that. And I thought, well, yeah, you'd expect a patissier to maybe be in charge of those things, but I'm not going to include that in my baking. So essentially, I very much went with baking adjacent and the work of the desserts of the patissier that doesn't involve flour out, roast beef out, casseroles out, but anything else baked in an oven or baked in a griddle is in. So that's what I came up with. Feel free to disagree. I don't mind. So now that we know what baking is, at least what I think baking is, let's just quickly talk about the very first bakers and where they were, who they were, and perhaps when it all occurred. There's a chicken and egg problem. You see people, historians sort of banging on about the sort of crucible of civilization all the time, saying, well, we needed bread for civilization to occur. Or you might think, well, we needed people together to make bread. And there's a bit of a catch-22 chicken and egg situation going on, actually, when you think about it. We need settlements so that people can farm and make bread, but people won't farm and bake bread unless there's a settlement. So which came first? Was it the chicken or was it the egg? Well, what we certainly know is that the first cereals to be domesticated were in the Fertile Crescent in the Near and Middle East, in what's known as a Fertile Crescent, about 7,000 BC. Here it is. And that is very much the crucible of farming of cereals, being wheat and barley being the main two, but also oats and rye to some degree, although they weren't really the powers of those two weren't really harnessed for a while. They were considered a bit of a weed for ages, actually. So this is when people were really cultivating and selectively growing these different species of plant, and they were doing very well. However, the earliest example of this is archaeologically speaking now of bread being baked goes all the way back to, well, another perhaps up to 5,000 years before that in the Black Desert in Jordan. If your history is not great, if your geography is not great, it's just there where it says Syrian desert, it's just above there. And people were making essentially a dough or a batter of barley and cooking it on their little hearthstones, essentially. And the way that, so this is, we're talking, let me get my terminology right. This is Mesolithic man. So right in the middle of the Stone Age. They're using fire, and round a Stone Age fire is always a ring of stones. It keeps the fire in. You know, it's an early example of health and safety. But these stones also get really hot. It takes a lot of energy to get stones hot, but once they're hot, they stay hot for ages, and the heat that comes off them is very even. So what people were doing, they were cooking their food, and who knows how it started. You could conjure up 100 different reasons how this could have happened. Someone accidentally spilled some on there, or maybe people were very clued up and knew what would happen. I consider it's probably the latter. But very quickly, people started using these bake stones. They then began to selectively find the flattest stones. You see this changing in the archaeological, in archaeology, and then you get people working the stone so they're very flat indeed, and then eventually they get swapped for iron, cast iron. Now, this technology, like I say, of the Fertile Crescent, so of selectively growing plants, harvesting them, drying them, grinding them, baking them into a bread on bake stones. There's no actual ovens at this point. Goes back to 7,000 BC. It takes 2,000 years for that technology to reach Britain. 2,000 years. So technology travels very, very slowly in the prehistoric world. But there are examples of, well, the first, what could you call them, proto ovens in prehistory. You know, ovens don't come out of nowhere. Some person didn't just invent the beehive oven. You know, it'll have gone up in stages of getting more complex, more thought, with improvement going over time. But Mark Meltonville, food historian, he's done a lot of work in prehistoric England, and he's got a whole team with him too. And they found a really early example of perhaps a rudimentary oven. So what they found in England was lots of earthenware pots, because earthenware technology was quite early. You put those pots straight onto the fire and maybe cook a soup or a pottage or something like that on there. And you see scorch marks on the bottom as evidence of this. But what him and his team found was that the pots weren't being used like this. They were being used tilted almost completely on their side. They could tell that by the scorch marks, and the scorch marks kind of fading out as you get near the lip. And what you got there is a very simple, almost beehive oven, which will suck in hot air from the fire, and you get a little sort of bit of air channeling through it as you get with the beehive oven. So it seems like we're just using stuff that they had around, just utilizing them in a different way. You could get a rudimentary oven. And as soon as you've got some air all around your little cake of dough that you've made, as soon as you've got heat all around it, that means you get a bit of lift. And that makes all the difference. Having a little bit of tenderness and a bit of lift in your bake, you know, really, really improves it. So I thought that was very interesting. So sticking with England, now I'm going to jump a few centuries ahead to the early medieval period. or Anglo-Saxon, but that's a dirty word these days, Anglo-Saxon, isn't it? We shouldn't be using it because people have been sadly misusing that term. But anyway, the Romans are the ones who seem to have invented the beehive bread oven. You know, the ones who see pizzas being made in these days. And artisan bakers around the world would probably say that is the pinnacle of ovens. You can't really beat that for quality of baking. But of course, that didn't stop the oven evolving. It carried on. But yes, looking at the Anglo-Saxons, it's really interesting. And I'm saying Anglo-Saxons rather than early medieval because the whole of the early medieval period, the first few hundreds of it, there are no Anglo-Saxons there. So I feel like I have to use Anglo-Saxon now. But you read various documents. You know, there's a surprisingly large number of manuscripts found. You know, people talk about this as the Dark Ages, and it really isn't the Dark Ages at all. And you see how important bread is to daily life. Essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't speak Old English, paraphrasing, but essentially, a meal, any meal, is not a meal unless there's bread. The whole community is fixed upon making bread. And here's a fantastic illustration here of a early medieval watermill by Steve Rigby. You know, and you say words like rudimentary, but they knew what they were doing. They could use wood in ways that none of us would be able to do today. They were highly skilled people. And there were watermills from a sort of 6th century onwards, by the way, in Britain. So yeah, it's a communal effort. There's bread and there's beer. So the brewers and the bakers are usually built next door to each other. You can scoop off your yeast from the top of the brewing vat, the barm. In the Northwest, people still call their bread cakes barm cakes because of this, because you take your barm off from the brewers, mix it in with your dough so you can get nice leaven bread. And there's examples of this pairing going right back to ancient Egypt, of the brewer and the baker being built next door to each other. Yes, this is an ancient synergistic relationship between the two. And there's little clues as to how important all of this was, really, but in our language today, because we still use some Old English words, but they've evolved as well through the centuries, like anything else. And again, I mean, my pronunciation is going to be awful because Old English is a tonal language, and yeah, I'm not great with languages, but I'm going to give it a go. Our word Lord comes from Layford, which means loaf ward or the distributor of bread. Conversely, lady, I mean, good luck with this one, Neil. Layfidge? I don't know. But it means kneader of loaves. So you might quickly begin to get a bit misty-eyed about all this and think, oh, isn't that nice? Like, the Lord was the person who distributed the bread and the lady was there dutifully kneading everything together. Well, yeah. I'm going to introduce a third character, actually. We've got our Lord and our Lady. We've got our Miller. And anybody of a certain age from the UK, by certain age, I mean 40s and older, may recognize Windy Miller from Camberwick Green, one of the best television programs, children's television programs ever made. Yeah, everyone used to love Windy Miller. He's probably the most popular character. So we think, oh, that's nice. We've got distributors of loaves, kneaders of loaves, and we've got Happy Windy Miller making the flour. Well, that is not how it was, I'm afraid. It was actually these three people were controlling the rest of the population. Everybody else was there growing the grain, harvesting it, all that kind of stuff. But the miller would grind it and distribute it how he saw fit, i.e., to the Lord and the Lady. And they baked the bread and they distributed it as they saw fit as well. And actually, what it was the beginnings of the English feudal system is very much in how bread or the ingredients for bread were produced and how the final product was given out. So I thought I'd just talk that's kind of my serious history bit of the talk. Because I just thought it's really interesting. There's another word, I can't remember it is off the top of my head, but there was a word for the rest of the population, and they were called the loaf eaters. And it was kind of a bit of a snobbish kind of word for the swinish multitude who are doing all the hard work, of course. But that's the way things go. And, you know, we're an aspirational country in England, with the whole of Britain, really. I know it happens in every country, but, you know, England seems to be the absolute worst for it. And you can, the further back you go, you can still see evidence for that kind of thing. It seems to be in our bones, unfortunately, but there you go. So I'm going to do a bit of a jump cut now and talk about pies and pasties. And the reason is, so we can think of bread and cake, you know, they're terms that very much are moldable. Some breads are called cakes, some cakes are called breads, and there's things in between. But whatever you want to call them, it's a baked product that you sit and eat because it's delicious. Pastry is a bit different because back in the early days, people weren't eating the pastry. The pastry was a covering for something else, but I'm going to get to that in a second. Anybody who's been caught, especially on a train or between trains or in stations going around the UK, have been caught short and will have picked up. Is it a ginsters or is it a gingsters pasty? I don't know which. Anyway, there one is. Here's a very miserable picture below of a Greg's meat and potato pasty. It looks so horrible, doesn't it? They don't even specify what meat it is in their meat and potato pasty. You know, there's always been a certain amount, or not always, more recently, there's a certain amount of suspicion about, you know, what's inside of pies and pasties. Is it just all the little horrible odds and ends that the butcher's not going to use? Gristle and hooves and what have you. It's got a bad reputation, hasn't it? So viewed with a certain amount of suspicion. I mean, especially as in the 80s. I mean, I hated anything like that because everything was so gristly and it put me off eating meat for a good 10 years, which is the horrible, cheap pies and sausages and horrible stuff. Things are a bit different now, I think. But if you go back to the Middle Ages, so we go back to medieval period, and pies and pasties are very posh indeed. Your regular person in the street is not going to be eating pies and pasties. I've got some examples here from a couple of different cookbooks. Two of my favorite cookbooks, in fact. So this one here is some illustrations from The Accomplished Cook by Robert May, 1660. Here is a pasty. So inside there is probably diced venison, wild boar, maybe lamb or something like that. But sometimes pasties contain whole joints of meat, like a wild boar leg or a whole haunch of venison, covered up in pastry, shoved in the oven. Also, he's got some pretty fancy looking, rather strange shaped other pies here. This is a sort of cylindrical one. Here's a perfect square. And well, let me just read this out. I kept this on in purpose. I didn't trim it off when I was making these slides. So this is to bake any kind of heads. And first of the ox or bullock's cheeks to be eaten hot or cold. So I'm assuming that pasty is for ox cheeks. Which is nice. And if you go a little bit below, you can see the first line of the recipe, which is so gross. So I'm going to read it out. It's the first thing you got to do. Being first cleansed from the slime and filth, cut them, I'm assuming their heads, into pieces, take out the bones, season them with pepper. Nice. If you look below that, here's a really, really strange shaped pie. We've got a hare with a pudding in its belly inside this pie. Hares were really high ranking, almost as high ranking as venison, actually. You know, you had to be really high up in the echelons of society to be eating a hare. And well, it says a pudding in its belly. We'd say a force meat or a stuffing these days instead of pudding. And here is a beautiful sort of template in Edward Kidder's book, The Complete Confectioner. And this is to help you sort of, you meant to draw this bigger and you can cut out the shapes to decorate your pasty. I think this is a mutton pasty. So it's a nice little, is that a dove in a tree? It looks like a dove to me. I'm not 100% sure. But anyway, whether it's a pasty or a pie, these pies were called coffins, by the way, which is very pleasing, isn't it? And they were all about preserving meat. So what you do is you'd bake this, you get your leg of wild boar, wrap it in pastry, bake it, then you'd keep it cool somewhere. Sometimes when it comes out of the oven, you might fill it with hot spiced wine to help it keep longer. But essentially, that's what it's there for. And this is better than earthenware because, of course, you can make each one bespoke to the shape of the stuff that you try to bake. So earthenware was kind of useless. Also, earthenware was extremely expensive and extremely heavy. So, it was good all around. But this is posh people's food. So they could, first of all, have access to the meat, which most people didn't. They could afford to use flour in the baking that wasn't eaten. So again, these are people with plenty of food to eat. They also had to have an oven big enough to do some of these pies, and some of them get pretty big, as you will find out. They became absolutely massive. If there's anybody squeamish, you might want to put it on mute for a couple of minutes. Right, here we go. Strap in. They became huge. By the early 18th century, there was a thing called a Yorkshire Christmas pie. The first recipe for one pops up in Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, 1747. But the way she describes it, although she gives you a few sort of descriptions of what they are and what they're for, I've got a feeling they'll have been around for 3 or 4 decades before this first recipe, by the sounds of things. And well, I recreated this recipe on a TV show, and it was an absolute bloody disaster, let me tell you. It took me a week to make the pie, and it had to be cut out of the show. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on that bit too much. But anyway, there's some photographs of the pie that I made. They're pretty grotesque. So her recipe had 5, those kind of, you bone a load of different birds and you stuff them inside each other. It's one of those. And there was 5 in hers. Let me try and get this right. It went pigeon in a partridge, and then those 2 in a chicken, then those in a goose, and then those in a turkey. So what you're supposed to have is something that just looks like a turkey, but in fact what it is some horrible, grotesque Russian doll. So there we go. This is the pie that I made. Oh my Lord. I mean, it was absolutely massive. So in the recipe, she says to fill in any other gaps with jointed hairs and any other game birds you can find. So that's what the other picture is. Look, there's me all looking pleased with myself before it all went horribly wrong and collapsed in the oven. But anyway, and got burnt on the outside. It required 17 kilos of flour to make the pastry. It took me a week to make that pastry. Yeah. Anyway, never mind. But preservation really was key because these pies, you put the lid on, you put kilos of butter on top of all of that, put a lid on, bake it. And like I said, it would preserve these things. The butter would create a layer so no air could get in there. So it was great. You could stick it in a horse and carriage, send it from, some wealthy landowner in Yorkshire who's got all this game to hand, of course, send it to their mates, maybe who are in York or even London, as far down as London these things were going. So they had to be built really well. You had to be sure you baked it all the way through, and they were fantastically decorated. So you didn't want to burn them either. These people were working with ovens, nothing like the things we've got today, where you're testing the temperature by seeing how long it takes a bit of paper to turn brown and stuff like that, and extrapolating from that how long your pie is going to take. These were really highly skilled people. And it was a St. Stephen's Day treat. That's the 26th of December, the day after Christmas Day. Boxing Day wasn't a thing yet. That will mean nothing to you if you live outside of the UK. I think it's just the UK that has Boxing Day. But I think, is it King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen, didn't he? So he was doing that on so he was looking out of his window on the 26th of December was King Wenceslas. So that's pretty grotesque, I'm sure you'll agree. But here's some more examples. This is one that I found from the Stamford Mercury, the 15th of January, 1808. A cutting about Earl Grosvenor, who was the mayor of that city. He threw quite a few parties that year. And here's the description. At Earl Grosvenor's second dinner at Chester as mayor of that city, there was a large Christmas pie which contained 3 geese, 3 turkeys, 7 hares, 12 partridges, a ham, and a leg of veal. The whole, when baked, weighed 154 pounds. That's 70 kilos. Absolutely nuts. Um, some of you might have heard of or have met Ivan Day, food historian. He's a very inspiring chap. He holds the record for finding the biggest. The one that I found pales in comparison to the one that Ivan Day found. He definitely wins. Oops. There we go. Read that list. So 1763, this was a Yorkshire Christmas pie. Well, not actually made in Yorkshire, but in Cumbria, in fact, at Lowther Hall. And look at this. I mean, let's just do some highlights. So I counted, there's 25 different species of animal in this one pie. 15 woodcocks among them, 46 yellow hammers. Those little cute little yellow birds that come in the summertime. 20 rabbits, 1 leg of veal, half a ham. It weighed 22 stone. That's 140 kilos. So yeah, he holds the record. I got this information, by the way, from his really good blog. He doesn't write it anymore, but it's still online. It's called Food History Jottings. And if you're interested in, especially the early modern period, he really focuses on that and the 18th centuries. Yeah, loads of stuff on there. I would really urge you to check out his blog. It's fantastic. So yeah, this is the kind of crazy stuff that very rich people who get competitive ended up doing. In fact, I was talking to Ivan about this a couple of weeks ago, and he calls it extinction pie, which not too far from the truth. Certainly the trees must have been less tweetier after Christmas that year than before. That's for sure. Well, huge pies weren't just in the realm of rich people. Sometimes the regular person like you and I get to try some crazy big pies. And I want to introduce you to the Denby Dale pie, because this is one of my favorite things I've ever found ever. I just think it's great. It's only been baked 10 times. The first one was 1788 and the last one was the year 2000. The first one was made at the White Hart pub in Denby Dale, which is in Yorkshire, by the way, in the Yorkshire Dales. And it was baked to commemorate George III being cured from his madness. So that's nice. Anyway, somebody, talk about a butterfly flapping its wings, one side of the world and the other side of the world, you get a hurricane or something. This is a bit of an perfect example of that, because what somebody said there was, hey, let's do another pie when an important event occurs, but let's have a rule that the next pie has got to be bigger than the previous one. So everyone went, yay, that sounds like a good idea. Well, anyway, this is what happened. Number 2 was made in 1815 to celebrate the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, so that's fair enough. And inside that pie was 2 sheep and 20 fowls, which I'm assuming are chickens. So 2 sheep, that's pretty good. That's quite a mutton pie, isn't it? Number 3, 1848, repeal of the Corn Laws. And in fact, what we have here is a commemorative play for that one. This is when it starts getting good, at least in my opinion. It was of an unprecedented size, 135 small furred and feathered game and poultry, 5 whole sheep. They were really up in the ante, a calf, and 100 pounds of beef. I don't know why they went in such big increments, but anyway. Peter Breers, by the way, who's done great research, has got a book on traditional Yorkshire food, and this is where I got this information from, by the way. Yes, this one, he says, came to a sudden end when its supporting platform collapsed and a crowd of 15,000 scrambled for pieces, demolishing it utterly and throwing it to the winds. So, I mean, this is attracting massive crowds. 15,000 people came to see this pie getting cracked open. Number 4. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of these, don't worry. Just the ones of note. Number 4, 1887, Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. 1.5 tons we're at now. And this is just number 4. Now, the mayor came up and he cut the first slice, and the absolutely rotten and powerful stench of decomposing meat filled the air. It was a game pie full of dodgy game. It seems that maybe had been hung before it was being cooked, and there was a rumor that there was even a fox in there, but maybe I'm not sure if that's true. Now, obviously, a huge amount of effort got into making this pie. So, not to admit failure, the people of Denby Dale put the pie on a hearse, a horse-drawn hearse, paraded it through the town, and buried it just outside the limits under lime, because obviously it was going to be pretty stinky. And they gave out little funeral commemorative cards, to mark its passing, which I kind of think is quite sweet. It's macabre, but it's sweet too. Anyway, the last one, the year 2000, the Millennium Pie. Well, this was so big that it had to be designed by the School of Engineering at the University of Huddersfield. It was 40 feet long, 8 foot wide. There was 5 tons of beef in it, 2 tons of potatoes, 1 ton of onions, 200 pints of John Smith's bitter. How about that? I wonder if there's ever going to be an 11th pie. I mean, I would stick at a nice round 10 if I was, the mayor of Denby Dale, but you never know. But anyway, yeah, I hope that's giving you kind of an idea of the kind of stuff that's in the book. So kind of silly stuff like the Denby Dale pie, but also, a bit of the sort of more serious, how have we got to where we are now sort of history. Just to let you know, so it's out on the 12th of September, 2 days' time. But next month, on 24th of October, I have a book called The Philosophy of Puddings coming out, which is published by the British Library. And of course, there are some baked puddings, but luckily both subjects are so big that there's next to no overlap between the two. If anything, they're a companion, that make a companion piece. I'll do another talk on. I'll talk about puddings closer to Christmas, because it's when we eat a lot of puddings anyway, at least in the UK. So it's maybe makes sense to do it at the beginning of December. And like I say, perhaps there's going to be one somewhere around Halloween too. I'd really like to do a monthly one, but I'm going to dip my toe in for the rest of the year and see how they go. Because like I say, I really enjoy doing these. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking. I'm just going to say a couple more things, because I'm not sure how you found out about this talk. So I'm going to potentially fill in some gaps in your knowledge. I've got a podcast called the British Food History Podcast, which has been going for a few years now. And will be beginning my 8th season later on this month. I've been recording some conversations for that. I've got another podcast, which is rather newer, which is with Alessandra Pino and Sam Bilton. And it's kind of it's a very incomplete encyclopedia of food and drink. We've done season A, and soon we're going to be recording season B. So if you've got any suggestions for B foods and drinks that we can look at, we'll be very happy to have your suggestions. And if you've not seen my blogs before, there's britishfoodhistory.com and there's neilcooksgrigson.com, which is where everything began, Neil Cooks Grigson. And there's my social media handles, like I mentioned before. And I've got quite a few events coming up, actually. I've mentioned there's 1, maybe 2 in the rest of the year. I've just put a new tab on my website with upcoming events, because I'm doing various appearances and things around the country. Got one in Manchester. I'm at Hay on Wye Festival in the winter. I'm at Warwick, all sorts of places. So if you're in the UK, it'd be great to see you in person. So check those out. But news of online events are going to be in there too. And if possible, I mean, I'm going to try and keep all this kind of stuff for free at point of service. But if you want to support the blogs, the podcasts, and the talks and things like that, and treat me to a virtual coffee or pint, you can do in the support the blog and podcast tab, or you can become a £3 subscriber and you get some extra episodes of the podcast, extra recipes, newsletter, that kind of stuff. But hey, the best way that you can support me, you know, if you can't afford that, and it's perfectly fine, is just to tell people about it. Tell people about the podcast and the blog and things like that. I'd be very, very grateful. Right, I'm going to stop talking now. That's the end.